This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Everyone's a critic on BFM 89.9.
Hello, you're listening to Everyone's a Critic. I'm Sharmila Ganesan, and today we're talking about a contemporary classical music concert. It's called Jalur Kita Cerita Kita. It's part of the UITM KLPac Composers Concert Series that's happening at KLPac. It is happening on the 26th of November, and we have joining us to talk about the show, the artistic director as well as composer herself, Adeline Wong, and Johan Othman, who is a composer, research specialist, and academic. Johan, Adeline, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shamila.
Thank you for having us.
This is really an interesting concept. So the name perhaps is a bit of a clue. It's called Jalur Kita Cerita Kita, and it essentially features 14 compositions, each dedicated to one state in Malaysia. Where did this idea come from?
So this started because I had the idea to commission 14 composers to research into 14 states. Well, essentially 13 states and federal territories of our country. So it's the first time that the organizer is the Malaysian Composers Collective. We are having a research element into composition writing as part of the creative process. So the research or study of the chosen state by the composer will be integrated as part of the composition process. And the aim of this project is to celebrate the rich heritage and traditions of our own country.
I was wondering how the process of putting together the show was. I mean, you've got 14 different composers. You're one of them. And then, of course, the show is being presented by the Malaysian Composers Collective. Johan is on board with the research and consulting. So I'm curious about how all of this came together.
Honestly, there was a lot of planning to do initially for this process. And I'm very thankful that Johan, was one of our very crucial planning here when he came in as our researcher specialist here. So essentially, Shamila, there are two phases in the selection process. So the first phase, the composers send in their submission, their chosen state, and a short proposal on their research ideas and how it is integrated into their creative and composition writing. And then we shortlist the composers from this stage. And of course, we also ask composers to send in their examples of music compositions so that we know, how their music is and what their background is. And after me and Johan, look through the proposals, we then shortlist a few composers to submit their works for this project. So this is, I would say this is the largest scale production that the Malaysian Composers Collective has organized, because I don't think there has been a concert where we have 14 composers. So here we have also the performance element, and we have two groups of performers, and I'm actually really excited about it. So the first group is from Malaysia, the Strings, and they're from a very talented pool of musicians from the ensemble Virama. And the second group is actually from Yong Siew Toh Conservatory of Music in Singapore, where I actually teach.
What sort of research goes into something like this, Johan? Where did your specialty come in?
Yeah, I spoke about how the definition of research with Adeline, and Adeline said go all the way out. Go all the way out in terms of share my expertise in research. When we create something, we are usually inspired. Is usually what the term is, inspired. So I speak to the composers, the young composers, and they are all matured composers. Actually, we call them young, but they are maturely young, youngly matured. What I learned from research essentially is to not just to be inspired, but to actually go deeper into looking at what one is inspired by. For instance, if, for example, to go to Kelantan, if one is composing based on a theme of the state of Kelantan, it's not just enough to read about it, but also to immerse oneself into the culture, into it as deep as one can. If possibly, to actually, if budget permits, to go there and to actually immerse oneself in the culture and to absorb it, really, really understand it more than just on a surface level. And there are techniques actually. I mean, there's no time to go into that here, but there are academic techniques whereby you can really, really incorporate all the technical research into the music. So it's more than just being inspired. It is actually there's a mechanics of going about translating culture of the particular state into sounds.
Adeline, before we get into the pieces themselves, who are the composers involved? I mean, I know there are 14, even if we don't go into each of them. I think to get a sense of, the caliber and the types of variety that you're showcasing.
Yes, there is a wide range of composers represented. With the younger generation, we have students. And students from Malaysia, students who are studying in Singapore and abroad. So we have one student who's studying in US, two from Singapore, and one from Malaysia. So, that's quite a variety of a younger generation. We have up-and-coming composers, who's already come back from graduating from their degrees, and now they're starting their career as young composers. And also we have established composers, who's already been composing and made their name for quite a while in Malaysia and abroad. And also, interestingly, this time we have also composers who have actually kind of retired from composition, but would like to now, pick it up again and, continue their creative process. So we're really, really happy to have such a wide selection of composers for this concert.
Adeline, you're presenting a work as well. It's called Sembilan, which obviously is inspired by Negeri Sembilan. I was curious what that piece is about.
Well, I used the word and title from Negeri Sembilan because, Negeri Sembilan, it's made up of the 9 districts. And so my piece actually consists of 9 small sections that forms the overall structure of the piece. And the overall structure of the piece is also very much based upon this buffalo horn design that is predominantly found on the rooftops of Negeri Sembilan, the traditional Minangkabau homes. So you see, you don't really, and also the ensemble, the Cap Lempong ensemble, which is the traditional ensemble from Negeri Sembilan. So I use instruments from the Western instruments, something like the M-Glocken, which sounds very much like the traditional idiophones. I also use the oboe, which is quite similar to the Serunai sounds, and of course some membrane drums, the gendang that we hear. So they're all translated into Western instruments. So you can hear hints of that in the piece. But the overall structure of the work, it follows that kind of curve and arch form of that buffalo horn design.
Johan, I wanted to ask you about this notion of drawing on the different states, because I think there is a tendency to think of Malaysia as a whole, but even just through Adeline's example, each state actually has such a rich and distinct variety, not just when it comes to music, in fact, but even, architecture and art and culture and language. How does one translate all of those different elements into sound and into music?
Okay, so Shamila, very, very important question. The thing is, every composer, when I was giving a talk about how to do research and incorporate information into the music, I try to be very careful to stay away from being ethnocentric, meaning that every composer must have their own way of translating. That gives this project a very interesting nuance in the sense of, there's in sense of individuality. So, for example, you can put a char kway teow on the table and 10 composers will completely translate it in a different way. So, in a way, it reflects Malaysia as a multiplicity. The word Malaysia is one, but it's like a salad bowl whereby you have multiple. So translation is both multiple. At the same time, all 14 states have individuality. At the same time, they all also transcend their individuality. They merge with one another. So how does one do it? It depends on the individual. But basically what I tell them is to, culture can be anything, can be language, can be food, can be architecture, can be building, can be the people, can be how one wants to incorporate what they observe on the particular state. So basically, there is no one formula, but essentially is to go deep into how one defines what Kelantan is, how one defines what Pahang is, how one defines the other state is. So we get to hear 14 composers and 14 ways of defining states.
So we've been speaking about Jalur Kita Cerita Kita, which is a show that platforms the 14 different states in Malaysia through contemporary music, one piece for each state. And that's showing on the 26th of November at the Kuala Lumpur Performing Arts Centre. We will be back after this with more from Johan Othman and Adeline Wong. But in the meantime, here's a little taste of what you can expect from the show. This is Laksamana Bentan by Tengku Irfan, which is inspired by the state of Johor.
Bodacious, fabulous minds. BFM 89.9, the business station.
Welcome back. You're listening to Everyone's a Critic with Sharmila, and I'm speaking today with composer, artistic director Adeline Wong, as well as composer, research specialist, academic and consultant Johan Othman. We're speaking about Jalur Kita Cerita Kita. It is a showcase of 14 different contemporary classical pieces that are inspired by the 14 different states of Malaysia, and it features a variety of composers. It is showing on the 26th of November at the Kuala Lumpur Performing Arts Centre. And you just heard there a little bit of Fight for Love by Jeong Tan, which is inspired by the state of Malacca, just to give you a little sense of what the show will sound like. So to pick up on our conversation, Adeline, I wanted to ask you, what are we seeing in this lineup of pieces? What sorts of inspiration have the composers taken? What are the different sounds and what are the soundscapes that we'll be seeing in the show?
For each composer, what you will hear is their unique and fresh sounds, which is deeply personal, with imagination and freshness and a wide variety of styles and colors. And this word color is very important in this concert, because colors to composers are really important. Because if we move beyond just the melody, the chords, and the bass, when we combine everything together, we get the color of the music, color and texture. But more importantly is these musical styles and colors capture the diversity of the people of Malaysia, who are colorful, contrasting, exciting, and refreshing. So this is really a celebration of the people of Malaysia, I would say.
Johan, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the distinct cultural features or inspirations that we're seeing in these pieces? If you could highlight a few that perhaps you think are particularly interesting that are making their way into classical contemporary.
It ranges from nature to the metropolitan. For in Sarawak, we have the hornbill, the call of the birds. Of course, there's many birds, specific birds that venture around our so-called region. One composer, which is a colleague of mine, who picked Sarawak, but Sarawak you can pick that there are tons in every state. For example, we have the Rafflesia, the biggest flower in the world. We have, of course, the river, the big largest cave. There's so many one can pick from. But interestingly, there is this composer picked the hornbill, the bird, for the bird call. Apparently there was one at Pahang. We have, of course, the another bird call also that's based on the rainforest. Okay, Taman Negara. And then, of course, Melaka, we have their the songs, the music, and of course, Adeline herself, she based on symbolism, numbers, 9, and then we have the physical architecture, and we have the instrumental association. So every composer have their unique association at that particular moment. Probably tomorrow, Adeline would write probably a different piece. So one time there was a composer who tried to do, in fact, char kway teow, I believe so, or on a restaurant, and then we advised to sort of adjust on that. So it ranges. Okay, there's one also on cityscapes. About the stress of Johorians crossing the bridge to Singapore to work. These societal patterns also can be a source of inspiration. So every state is unique, at the same time very, very rich with many, many ideas. In fact, you can go more than one piece per state actually.
Adeline, you talked earlier about evoking the sounds of Negeri Sembilan through classical music and instruments. I was curious about that coming together, because one would think that something like contemporary classical, which is viewed to be very Western and uses sounds that are particularly, a very specific sound. How does that work when you translate it into evoking a landscape, a culture that is different and may have a whole different idea of sound?
Yeah, so that's why, each piece, is very different. Some composers, when you hear their works, they are directly linked to the chosen subject. The reference is very strong. But some works are less direct with subtle hints and reference. So, this research into those states, it may not come across as very direct, but, for example, you use the architecture. There's another composer who uses the Blue Mosque in Selangor as his research subject. And I mean, it has to do with how he looks at the structure of the mosque. And this then becomes part of the creative process. So you see, it doesn't mean that, you're coming to a concert where you just hear traditional Malay, traditional or traditional Chinese music or Indian music, because that's part of Malaysia's rich culture. But here, composers are reimagining this into their own voice and their own sound, which is actually really important. And, we take something as simple as perhaps it could be just the shape of the melody, If we don't use the particular scale that we want to use, associated with a more traditional setting, we could take the shape of that scale, and that could become the entire piece of the music, which some composers actually have done in this. So it is very traditional as well as very modern at the same time, because composers are reimagining this into their own voice, which is really important.
In fact, it has come to this point whereby the tables are turning and still turning, meaning to say that the Western, in the turn of the century, they have already evoked the non-Western, like Balinese gamelan, into the French music. For example, Debussy's pieces, the French pieces, and Messiaen himself have come to our country to even the French composer have come sample some of our birds here. So this project is super, super interesting in the sense of it questions this idea of notion of West, East, and West, East, and West. Can one take a Western instrument to express a non-Western theme? Essence, and can one take, in fact, a local instrument to express, like the erhu, to express a Western theme? So it opens up this question about East and West demarcation. In other words, yes, the answer to your question, yes, it's possible to transcend culture in terms of the soundscapes, but it might, there's this purist, contest between the purists and the modernists. But then again, the world actually it's only divided by political boundaries. political, cultural, and social boundaries, but actually it's just one plonk of earth. That's it.
I'm obviously very biased because this sounds very, very exciting to me. Just the idea of 14 different pieces inspired by each state. But I wanted to get you to, I suppose, sell the show a little bit, particularly to those who may not think of themselves as fans of classical music. How would you invite them to come to this regardless?
I would say for audience, you should come with an open mind, relax, and just take in the music that you hear, and let the 14 composers take you on a musical tour of our 14 states in a colorful world of sound, and also rediscover the diversity.
I would say, give an analogy, it's just like, we have to update our phone, iOS, or, our operating system of the phone. And, of course, keep downloading apps. So, to expose oneself to new kinds of sounds or different kind of sound, it widens our imagination. It might be strange to us, it might be painful to listen to some, it might be wonderful to listen to some. Keep on downloading new apps, one will be able to somehow update one's operating system mentally.
Johan, Adeline, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Sharmila.
You're most welcome, Sharmila.
I've been speaking with Adeline Wong, who is artistic director as well as a composer herself, as well as Johan Othman, who is a composer, research specialist, and academic. And we've been talking about Jalur Kita Cerita Kita. It is a showcase of 14 different classical contemporary compositions inspired by each of the states in Malaysia. It is being presented on the 26th of November by the Malaysian Composers Collective. And for tickets, you can head on over to malaysiancomposers.com. You've been listening to Everyone's a Critic, BFM 89.9.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.